All right. Hello, everybody. I'm Professor Jahoski here, and we're from Mythic Mission number, my goodness, 18 already. So tonight we have joining us Dr. David Downing and his lovely wife, Dr. Crystal Downing, who are co-directors of the Marion E. Wade Center at Wheaton College in Illinois, where they are also co-holders of the Marion E. Wade Chair in Christian Thought. David has written 4 scholarly books on C.S. Lewis, such as Into the Wardrobe, which I'm currently reading, which is an in-depth overview of the Chronicles of Narnia. Dr. Crystal Downing is a formerly distinguished professor of English and film studies at Messiah College in Pennsylvania. Crystal's most recent book on Dorothy Sayers, which was honored with a starred review by Publishers Weekly, is called Subversive: Christ, Culture, and the Shocking Dorothy L. Sayers. Thank you both for making time this evening to be with us.
It's great to be here.
And yes, no, I appreciate you. And Sarah, my wife, hopefully will be joining us here to bounce some questions off both of you here. And we're going to be talking tonight, and let's see what I entitled today's episode. Kind of got a little creative here. Tolkien, Lewis, and Sayers walk into a pub. I'm sure that never happened.
Pretty close to that, pretty close.
Pretty close. It's the start of possibly a good joke. And
Yeah.
an interview with David and Crystal Downing. So we're in number 18 already. And as I told you, we've got a lot of English professors on and had some really great voices contributing to this. But I just can't wait to hear what you guys have to say about Lewis and Sayers and their faith and its influence on their fictional writings in particular. But feel free to drift if you want. And if there's something in any of the non-fictional pieces they did, please feel free to speak to that. But what I like to do with every podcast is I start asking what your academic backgrounds are a little bit, what you'd like to highlight, how you became a Christian, and especially did Sayers and or Lewis or both or Tolkien have any influence on your becoming a Christian?
Well, I will start out and tell you that both David and I grew up in Christian families. So we have the distinction of having our engagement announced in the Bible Study Fellowship newsletter, because both of us had mothers who were teaching leaders in Bible Study Fellowship. So we had very solid biblical backgrounds, went to Christian colleges. Then David got his PhD first at University of California in Los Angeles. I got my PhD then at the University of California in Santa Barbara. But
Crystal, was your team the one that went to the Final Four this year? Was that UCSB?
No.
Oh, I'm sorry. That was UCLA. I'm sorry. I got confused.
Uh-oh.
That was my school that went to the Final Four. Sorry.
This is why I don't keep up with sports.
Well, David, you should probably tell how C.S. Lewis was important to your conversion, even though you grew up Christian.
Yes, I was raised in a little church, evangelical free in Colorado, and they were good-hearted people, but they didn't seek very in-depth answers. They were content with fairly simple answers about Christian faith. When I was in 3rd grade, I asked my teacher, what about the Navajos? They were such good people. They made pottery, they made jewelry, they were not warlike. I mean, couldn't Christ save them? And my teacher said, well, God knew who would respond to the gospel and who wouldn't. And he put all the non-responders in the New World, North and South America. And he kind of knew, because at that time, there was no way to get a boat across the Atlantic. And so he said, basically, none of them would have responded to the gospel. And even as a 3rd grader, I said, that's not a very intellectually satisfying answer. So I asked my dad, and he said, David, you just need to trust in the character of God. He's the author of salvation. So don't worry about the logistics of salvation. Just concentrate on the author of salvation. That was a good answer for a 3rd grader. But I ran into a lot of what I consider to be kind of simplistic answers growing up in my little church. And when I went to college, I read Perelandra. And suddenly, I'd never read C.S. Lewis. I hadn't heard the name C.S. Lewis. But I suddenly found out that there was an author who was willing to use science fiction or fantasy as a vehicle to talk about theological ideas and spiritual ideas. And when I read Perelandra, I was hooked. Within a year at college, I went from never having read C.S. Lewis to having read like 40 books by C.S. Lewis, literally in 1 year. So Lewis was a real turning point author for me in terms of going from an iffy faith that was leaning toward unfaith or loss of belief into someone I felt this is so much more exalted and so much more expansive view of Christian faith than I've had before. So he was literally a crossways man for me, or a crossroads person for me in terms of directing me back toward faith. So that was way back when. And I've been more or less a Lewis scholar since my college days because that was such a watershed experience for me.
Yeah, several things came to mind there. I just started reading. I know I've upset a lot of people saying this. I've read Narnia. I've read so many of Lewis's nonfiction writings, but the man was really prodigious with his writing. He wrote quite a bit.
He was.
I never got around to the space trilogy, but I'm probably more than halfway through Paralandra. I'm loving it. It's just now becoming one of my favorite books. So, I hope at some point this evening it comes up, about your third grade experience, about the fate of the unknown, people that, we don't know that have responded to the gospel. I know this is something with my background in Tolkien. I've read a lot of Lewis as well. He was very concerned about this. I don't know if Sayers was. I don't know if she wrote anything about that, but I'd love to hear something about that a little later. But thank you for sharing Lewis's influence on your journey to faith.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Crystal, do you want to add something about Sayers?
Yeah.
Well, the transition in my faith happened when I got my first tenure track job. And it was at an Anabaptist school in Pennsylvania, Messiah College. And I had never encountered Anabaptists before. And of course, that's the tradition from which the Amish and Mennonites come. I had a colleague who grew up Amish and had to leave the Amish when he wanted to go beyond 8th grade, and was now a Mennonite bishop. And I still remember the first chapel I went to after I accepted the job, and the speaker was talking about a Mennonite man of God was asked, "Are you a Christian?" And as I was sitting there, I was thinking of the way I was trained to answer that question. Yes, I'm a Christian because when I was 8 years old, I asked Jesus into my heart and I was born again. And then as I thought about that, the story goes on. The Mennonite man of God answered the question, "Are you a Christian?" with, "Ask my neighbor." And I nearly fell out of my chair. I found that so profound.
Yeah.
And what happened at that moment, that moment made me realize the way I had internalized Christianity is I had turned language into a type of idolatry. So only if you use the right words are you a Christian, rather than, following Jesus. And of course, I still believe in the importance of being born again and those things. But I realized that I had a prejudice growing up, which a lot of more fundagelicals do, a prejudice against Roman Catholics, where I thought, oh, they idolize statues of Mary and, relics. And it was so convicting that I had idolized language. Well, that led then to my interest in Dorothy Sayers, because Sayers is someone who challenges our language. And so my first book was about Sayers, and now my 5th book is about Sayers. And then the other books in between are all about language, and especially semiotic theory, which is the science of signs. And it's because of that one moment in chapel at this Anabaptist college.
Very profound. And I saw, just looking over your CV, I think that there's a subtitle to one of your books. I think it said the medium is the message. And this is something, I came, or maybe it's the title, forgive me, but I came across this in so many books that I read for researching my book. And I found that it's a very, very powerful statement, especially with myth and its influence in storytelling and coming to belief. But yeah, that is a very profound story that you told. And I'm so glad you're here to talk about Sayers, because as I told you, I know virtually nothing. So I'm learning so much. And, we do tend, I think, as Christians sometimes to put so much in a proposition that we're saved by, confessing Jesus with our mouth in Romans 5. But it's more than that. It's
Yes.
what do people say? Am I following
Yeah.
Christ?
Right.
And
No matter how perfect my language is, if my neighbor doesn't know I'm a Christian,
exactly.
what is the point?
That's right. Yeah, and I just fear so many Christians, especially some of my students at the state college here, it's all about, well, we have to be seen using the right language and have to, speak Christian. And I just I'm disheartened by that. So I share a concern about that. And it's of course not to say that creeds and statements of belief are not important, but we put sometimes far too much attention in them. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, and the trouble is, a lot of people in the Protestant tradition aren't
Mm,
even familiar with the creeds. And
true.
so
That's true.
Sayers was very emphatic that, okay, the creeds, especially the first four ecumenical councils, and this, both Lewis and Sayers had this in common, that
Mhm.
this is Christian orthodoxy, what was determined at the first four councils.
Mhm.
And if you affirm that, then there is certain latitude in the interpretation and the application.
Certainly.
And, I have to think that where I taught at a school where I just found profound Christians who were had grown up Amish and were still very sensitive about the Amish.
Mm.
Oh.
Yeah. Well, I want to, there's so many questions that keep popping up that I now want to ask, but I want to stay on track here. Let's maybe start talking about myth and storytelling more broadly. Mythos, of course, as we're all aware, is a narrative about the way things are. So this was clearly an important concept to both Sayers and Lewis, and of course Tolkien. But I want to hear, especially from you two, about this is making a big splash in Christian apologetics. You have the works of Alistair McGrath and Holly Ordway, who are writing about imaginative apologetics. I'm trying to contribute a little bit. And I find that in my own personal life, I burned out on too much logos, too much of the rational side. And so many people can relate to that because we sometimes overemphasize that. Again, maybe it has to do with the language element there. But, I know you're both familiar with the concept, but what did Lewis and Sayers, in whatever order you want to speak to, think about this concept of myth? Because I think that they tried to save it and almost re-mythologize myth, if that makes any sense, for a modern.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. There's propositional truth where you could state the truth in terms of a subject, a verb, and an object. And then there's narrative truth, which is tell a story and you try to figure out what is the truth that is being portrayed in that story.
Mm-hmm.
Lewis really kind of got off track by reading James Fraser, the great anthropologist who did The Golden Bough, which said that all the world stories tend to have a lot of common themes, including the dying God myth. It could be Osiris, it could be Balder, it could be Jesus of Nazareth. And he kind of felt like, well, this is an archetype. It shows up everywhere. There's nothing special about the fact that it shows up in Judeo-Christian tradition. And then when he met Tolkien in the 20s at Oxford, Tolkien and his friend Hugo Dyson said, well, yeah, that's true. That myth shows up everywhere, but let's reframe that for you. Let's say that all cultures have an intuition of the dying God, the higher being who has to sacrifice himself in order to redeem the people. And so maybe they were all intuiting the need for that, but it wasn't until the myth broke into history that it really became true. Suddenly, Jesus of Nazareth, nobody knows where Osiris is buried. Nobody knows where Balder is buried, but people actually know that Jesus of Nazareth, in the first 30 years of the new century, he was crucified and buried and rose again. So that was a real breakthrough for Lewis. He and Tolkien and Dyson, as you well know, spoke until 3 o'clock in the morning. Yes. And Lewis finally said, wait a minute, this would be the most important event in human history if mythology became something that broke into the sphere of time and space and human history. So that was a huge breakthrough for Lewis, and suddenly went back and reinterpreted all of his view of mythology. He always said that you can't really capture reality in propositions. Reality is what it is, and truth is only an attempt to capture reality in statements. But he said in many ways, you can also capture reality in stories.
Yep.
So Lewis literally became a Christian when he realized that the myth became fact. The dying God myth actually happened in history.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't long after his conversation with Tolkien and Dyson that he decided he could become a Christian. He could affirm this as historical truth as well as true myth.
Yes.
And went on to have one of the most remarkable careers of the 20th century in terms of trying to decide what that meant for Christians and what that meant for culture in general.
Certainly. Yeah, I know he spoke, I think it's in his Myth Became Fact essay, and then his Theology, Poetry, both of them, that
Right.
I think it's in the former, that we mustn't be ashamed of the mythical radiance that rests upon our theology.
Right.
And I think
right.
so many Christians end up, thinking, oh, if we say it's a myth, that this is gonna hurt our witness. And so I think this
Right.
is really critical. And it's interesting that you say that, Dyson and Tolkien, they kind of used an argument that's traditionally used to disprove Jesus and to show how this is just like any other, it's a Jewish archetype,
Right.
like that one's a Hindu one, this is that. And he used it not almost exactly the reverse to show it as an example for the truth of Christianity. So
Right.
there's a lot going on there.
Point that there was no, in the Old Testament, there's no archetype of the dying God. They're not expecting God to come to earth at all because they're not into the idea of the transcendent God becoming a human being.
Mm-mm.
And so he says, of the least likely places for the dying God myth to become history, Judaism would be the least likely place to look for that
Conspiracy.
effect. So that was another argument for the truth of Christianity. He says reality isn't predictable, it isn't regular. It has a kind of weird aspect of being surprising and wonderful. And he said, well, this is it. This myth broke into history at the least likely place.
Yes.
So that was a huge starting point for Lewis. And as you know, with Tolkien, that was kind of, in a way, I think that was one of the foundational moments in their friendship, is to realize together that this mythology became history.
Yes, I quite agree. So did Lewis did Lewis talk to Sayers about this? Was Sayers on her own interested in myth in some way?
Well, that's interesting because it relates to my own faith transitional moment about recognizing the idolatry of language.
Yes.
Insofar as C.S. Lewis identifies as one of the most profound influences on the strengthening of his spiritual life. The BBC radio broadcasts of the life of Jesus that were written by Dorothy Sayers and broadcast 1941, 1942. But what's interesting about it, so here, when we read the Narnia Chronicles, Lewis is being nurtured by Dorothy Sayers' presentation of Jesus. But as she's presented it, she recognizes the power of narrative to get us to think in new ways. So she presents the gospel message. She doesn't change the gospel message about the death and resurrection Jesus and his miracles and all that. But then she provides narrative transitions to contextualize things. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But another thing she did, because she recognized the power of narrative to really break through to what Lewis says, to sneak past watchful dragons. But the trouble is, in her day, the watchful dragons were especially fiery because when there was a press conference to announce the first of the 12 plays, it came out in the press conference, because she read a snippet from one of her plays, it came out that these radio plays did not use King James English.
That's right. I remember reading that. Yeah.
Furthermore, some of the disciples she had speak slang. Worse, some of it was American slang.
Oh, yes. Oh, God, that's the worst.
This was actually a headline in a paper.
Wow.
Plays about Jesus in American slang. Talk about the idolatry of language, that these Christians rose up in protest. They demanded that the BBC censor these plays. They wrote letters to Winston Churchill and the Archbishop of Canterbury demanding that these plays not be broadcast. It actually was discussed on the floor of Parliament. That is how huge this scandal was.
I don't remember catching that detail. Wow.
Yeah.
That's
And-
incredible.
Was there a line, Crystal, that somebody said the Atonement is so groovy? Was that in?
No,
Dorothy Sayers?
no.
Oh, okay.
Um,
She didn't go that far. Sorry, she didn't go that far.
And it makes her goal was to show that the people who lived at the time of Christ, who followed Christ, who killed Christ, are like us.
Mm.
And the irony, God works in mysterious ways, is that because of this incredible scandal, I mean, this it's discussed in Parliament, and she got hate mail from Christians, she got nasty phone calls, but because of that, all these kind of cynics and non-Christians listened to the radio plays, which were on the religious programming channel, and for the first time in their lives, they understood the gospel message, because Sayers refused the idolatry of language. And we can see C.S. Lewis, of course, he has a sacrificial lion, talk about changing the story, but it's still the truth. He captures the truth with narrative. And so Sayers was still telling the gospel story, but by narrativizing details and refusing to use King James English. She got thousands of letters.
I can't believe that.
She wrote a letter to C.S. Lewis saying, I have gotten thousands of letters from people saying that they've, for the first time in their lives, they started reading the Bible, that they had returned to the faith, that they had started going to church, because she refused to back down, even though she was getting hate mail. She got one postcard that said, "You nasty old sourpuss." But
really?
She just was committed to the gospel message.
That's such a powerful example for our own day, that we need to stand our ground about things and with gentleness and respect. I want to say a couple things just real quick for our audience, because I don't think I've spoken about this here on Mythic Mission, but in my research, I've come across a distinction that's very helpful. I think you both will appreciate this, between subversion, which of course is subversive, the title of your book, and syncretism. Because I know in my textbook for Western humanities, I teach my students, I have to unteach and then reteach, this section about Mithraism and syncretism, and it's a bold term in our textbooks. And I go, listen, this is one possible understanding, but subversion is telling one narrative in terms of another narrative. I would say that's what Sayers and Lewis and Tolkien were doing. But syncretism is combining two narratives and having them kind of mishmash together. I mean, I think there's a fine line, but I think it's very powerful, that we also consider something else that I don't think I've spoken about here either, supposals, because this is what Lewis called the non-allegory, and I think, and I've talked about this several times, but I think many people give Lewis too hard a time. He had a very similar understanding to allegory that Tolkien did. I don't think people have read a lot of Lewis's letters, but he was very adamant against it and spoke instead of supposals. And it sounds like that's what Sayers had done, and recontextualizing things, transposing it into a different environment that seemed a little strange, but was you're still, like you said, you're not changing anything. It's not like she, taught something antithetical. And I think that that transposition, I know that Lewis spoke about too, is very, very powerful stuff. So that's good. Yeah,
Lewis was very careful in choosing the word supposal. Yes. Because he actually did write allegory. He loved the Spencer and Pilgrim's Progress and other allegories, where there's kind of a one-to-one correspondence between the physical character and the idea but he didn't, and he did write Pilgrim's Regress, which is allegorical. This character represents Freud, this character represents D.H. Lawrence. But when it came to his more serious imaginative works, he liked that word supposal. Suppose that God came to redeem a planet, but not as a human, but as a lion. And that's not allegorical, that's not symbolic, it's a supposal. It's a great word. He invented a new genre.
Yes.
And I'm sure you're sympathetic with Tolkien saying, I'm not doing allegory here. Sauron is not Hitler. Saruman is not Mussolini. So he talked, as you know, Tolkien said, I despise allegory, both real or feigned. I would rather have real history.
Mhm.
And he would rather have an imaginative history than to have an allegory.
Yep.
So you should probably speak a little bit about Tolkien, because they were on the same, in a way, they were on the same page in terms of not wanting a lot of fantasy with one-to-one correspondences.
Sure.
But was more audience-centered. I hope this affects my readers this way. It's more like, I just need to create this secondary world, which is so substantial and coherent in itself. I'm not going to worry about how the reader responds. You should probably take a moment here talking as opposed to Sayers.
Sure. I would say this probably applies, especially to what Crystal was speaking about with the use of language. In my research, I read a great book. Gisela Kreglinger wrote a book called Storied Revelations. I think it's about George MacDonald's writings. And she talks about the difference between metaphorical language and allegorical language. And I think what was important, and to quote one of Tolkien's letters, I forget which one, letter 180 something, he says, it's the way that truth is reflected in and exemplified in the ancient device of presenting something in an unfamiliar embodiment. Something to that extent is what he says. And, for the elucidation of truth and morals, but not as we know them explicitly in the real world. And what I came to discover is an allegory is, of course, going to have allegorical language. It's going to be very, very clear, very transparent, one for one. And this is what I found really interesting. Kreglinger said that it's allegory's job to remind you of what you already know. And that is not what Lewis, Sayers, or Tolkien are trying to do. They're trying to refresh and even maybe teach something new. Metaphorical language, now, most people, I think, don't really see much of a difference, at least in my experience. Are like, oh my God, what's the myth, allegory, metaphor? They're all the same to me. Well, I always understood metaphor is this for that, but that's not what these scholars have said. That metaphor is more suggestive, kind of teases implications. It's not a substitutionary kind of this for that. And I think they delighted in putting something on the table and then taking it away. As I had one person I did an interview with described it, which it just stuck with me. I'm like, yeah, that's right. They show their cards and then they kind of, hide them again. And it's kind of teasing the reader and the audience, as you were saying, and affecting us in a way that lures us into participation in the story. And that's the most important part, because if we don't participate in the drama of Christ and we don't treat it as a story that really happened, then we can't really understand anybody unless we step into their story. So to me, that was the big, there's Sarah or Lucas. Hi, Lucas.
Oh, hi.
So glad you could come on.
Thanks for joining us.
Ta-da. How'd she do?
I'm so sorry. Annabelle's actually sitting back here reading books because I still can't hear her go to sleep. So compromised.
Have you tried chloroform? Does that work at all?
A little bit. We've tried. It's not been successful. Nothing is going to keep this kid down. So it's funny because she heard us say that we were doing an interview earlier. She's like, "Oh, I want to watch it." And so I think it's coming true.
Yeah.
Well, I was just telling David and Crystal about the big revelation between metaphorical and allegorical language, and how for Lewis and Tolkien, we were talking about supposals before that, and myth, that to impact the audience and teach them something new about a subject that they already know. And if you're a Christian and you know Christianity, or you claim to know it, I'm sure, Crystal, you'll speak to this a little bit more too with subversiveness of Sayers' work. You have to really get underneath that person and kind of sap their worldview, because they're very confident that they've heard the parables, they know about Jesus, they can't learn anything new, it's old news. But it's amazing how much more we can learn through these writings of the Inklings. So,
well, modernism is very anti-allegory. They don't like the idea of they like the idea of open-ended meanings. They want, when you read Pilgrim's Progress, the giant is named despair. So you go, oh, I guess that big guy is a symbol of despair. And it's a little bit, it's not hermeneutically interesting to just tell somebody what the giant represents. Now, Lewis, even though he liked Pilgrim's Progress and other allegories, he liked Spencer's Fairy Queen. He said in what's the Weight of Glory, in the way the gospel is like the scent of a flower you've never smelled or seen. It's news from a country you've never visited. So he realized there was something open-ended about symbolism that was more evocative, because we really can't imagine heaven. We can't imagine, what is Christ doing? Is he sitting on a throne? What's it like to spend eternity with Christ? And he really doesn't want to try to pin that down, because anything you say becomes a New Yorker cartoon with clouds and harps and halos. And so he wisely says, let's keep that open-ended. Let's just suggest what it might be like to be one with beauty, to spend the rest of your life not just looking at beauty, but becoming immersed in beauty. So he ultimately felt, when it came to transcendent realities, you don't want to go for allegory, you want to go for symbolism. Ironically, as you know, Tolkien didn't like allegory because he thought it was too one-to-one, but he wrote a beautiful story called Leaf by Niggle, which is pretty obviously allegorical. The character is him, and he seems to go to purgatory and go through a lot of purification, and he ends up in paradise. So there's kind of it's not really a clear barrier between allegory, close-ended hermeneutics, and symbolism, open-ended. In some ways, both of them realize it's more of a continuum. In some ways, you don't want to be way allegorical, but you want to suggest enough that people really understand what you are talking about, what you're evoking.
Exactly.
So they both wrote very good allegories, and they both wrote very good symbolism. You should probably jump in and talk a little bit about your concept of parable and why you think that that's the best way to describe what Tolkien is doing.
Yeah, I will just briefly just say that I think everything that I've said here about the difference between the use of allegorical language and metaphorical language falls on that spectrum. And I talk about the spectrum in my book. And I think a parable is somewhere right where we want it to be, in the middle. It's just evocative and suggestive enough, in equal measures. And it's a give and take of the parables. And in my reading of a lot of New Testament scholarship books, this is how I've heard people like Brad Young and Craig Blomberg and Amy Jo Levine talk about parables as it's give and take and conceal and reveal. And I think that's exactly what Lewis's definition of symbolism is. And it's quite, of course, going to have some allegorical teases in it, but it's just in there enough to lure you into participation. And then the twist, according to what I found, is that metaphorical punch where, you come tantalizingly close to, okay, this is really suggestive of what we know to be the Christian truth. And so I think there's one great reason, one last thing I'll say, is that I found that not a lot of Tolkien scholars had written very much about it. And I've asked a few. I had Joseph Pierce on the show recently. I don't think we got a chance to talk about it, but in his collection, Tolkien: A Celebration, there's an essay from 1992 by Father Robert Murray, who was a friend and confidant of Tolkien in the,
Yeah, that's in that anthology, right?
Yeah, Tolkien and the Art of the Parable. And I came across it and I said, I've always felt like that's the right word for it. But I know that Tolkien didn't want to use it because it would, to a lot of, misinformed audiences, probably say, oh, that's the same as an allegory. And then it would be all gone from there. So I think it's basically this, that, Tolkien really, and I think Lewis too, in his own way, imitated Jesus's art of storytelling, which I think, obviously he laid down first. So,
well, as you say in your book, even the parables, there tends to be another continuum from heavily allegorical to somewhat evocative and suggestive, but not necessarily hermeneutically clear. Exactly. In The Prodigal Son, we can pretty much tell the younger son screwed up, made a mess of his life, came back very humbly and said to his father, will you forgive me and take me back in even as a slave? And the older son seems to be the more or less legalistic son who's always done what he's supposed to do, and he resents the fact that somebody else could get in on grace rather than on earning it. That seems very allegorical. But other parables, like the woman or the unjust steward who decides to tell all the clients, hey, I'll give you a percentage on your payback to my master. You're not quite sure what those characters represent. Who's the master? Who's the steward? Who are the people who are owed money? And so even within the parables, there's a continuum from the pretty clearly allegorical to the symbolic, suggestive, metaphorical, but you can't quite pin down the spiritual meaning of the heavenly story.
And I think it's best that way. I really do.
Right.
And it's at least impacted me very powerfully. So, Crystal, did you want to talk a little bit about Sayers and how she integrated her faith? And I had a question for you just before you start, and talk about whatever you'd like. But was she Catholic or Anglican?
No.
Okay.
She was born to an Anglican clergyman.
Okay.
So she was, she called herself Anglo-Catholic, so very high church Anglican. But she, in her youth, she tended to compartmentalize her Christianity, which you see with a lot of children of Christians and ministers. So she never renounced her faith, but she wasn't that concerned about integrating it into her life. And it wasn't until middle age that she had a transformative moment, kind of like my moment, sitting in the chair and hearing about a Mennonite man of God. She was asked to write a play because of course she was famous for Lord Peter Wimsey detective novels. And she's quite emphatic that Peter Wimsey is not a Christian. He's not interested in being a Christian. He loves the beauty of church architecture and liturgy, but he is not religious. And that's, she just didn't want to make him religious. And then when she was asked to write a play for Canterbury Cathedral, she was forced to really think about the relationship between theology and the arts, because the play was supposed to be about the history of the cathedral performed in the cathedral. So you have to think about, this is a great work of art built to celebrate Jesus Christ. And how do I think about what I am doing in my life? And that, after she wrote Zeal of Thy House, she never published another detective novel. And it totally took her in the direction of Christian apologetics and using her myth-making ability to communicate the gospel message. But the thing I wanted to pick up on, I loved how you said that many people have a mistaken idea of metaphor, and you use the phrase "this for that," which is kind of what allegory is. You know, this for that, the giant of despond or despair. And that is a key concept that Sayers is trying to subvert through her writings. And it is something that she educated me about. And I encountered the same thought in a famous, probably the most influential philosopher of the 20th century, Jacques Derrida, who talks about how most humans operate according to an economy of exchange, because that's the way language works. You give a word like hair, you get an idea in exchange. And because language is about exchange, most religions are about exchange. It's this for that.
Yes.
So go through this ritual, you get heaven. Say this prayer, you are saved. Believe this doctrine, and you avoid hell. And it, as soon as you reduce it, and that's the way all religions work. So what makes Christianity distinctive, and I use Sayers to argue how simplistic anyone is who says that, well, all religions lead to the same God. No, all religions except for Christianity, as far as I know, operate according to this economy of exchange, except Christianity, which is about a gift. It is a gift. And of course, belief is necessary, because how do you accept a gift unless you believe it's been offered to you? Right. But that's different than thinking, ooh, I don't want to burn in hell, I better believe this thing.
Exchangism, I remember reading in your book, and that's a term that has really stuck in my mind as I continue to read. Now I'm seeing it everywhere. And this is something Sarah's really wanted, as you said, to subvert. Sarah, I think you would really like to read Subversive after I'm finished. And I realize, honey, I've got them talking about a lot of the questions I wanted you to ask. So if you have some questions of your own, you might want to see if you have any. I just want to make sure you get a chance to contribute, because I know you, Sarah was going to do the questioning. So if something comes up, but I really think you'd enjoy it, because we both grew up with kind of an exchangeist. I mean, I had a loose Roman Catholic upbringing, and, that was, looking back, that was my understanding, is that you do this, you get something back. And it's interesting how that plays into what we said about language. And so I'm glad I'm not alone. I told somebody, I can't remember who it was, that, as I'm learning that other people are thinking along the same lines, I feel a little less crazy, because I thought as I was writing, Sarah knows, I'm sure you both have experienced this. I wonder if anybody else has seen this, or am I going to really look like a fool for saying this? But yeah, it's such a bad idea. And I really, maybe we should talk about the atonement too, because it was just Easter, of course. And this is something that you write about in your book, Subversive, where you talk about that it's not just a purely substitutionary theory, not just Christus Victor. I think you say it's kind of an amalgamation of the two.
Well,
if I understood.
How Sayers presents it, and I think she is quite accurate, is the atonement, our understanding of how the atonement worked changes as our context changes.
Mm-hmm.
And C.S. Lewis was quite direct about this, and David, you'll have to fill in. He said, the important thing is not to figure out how it works.
Mm-hmm.
It's to know that we have been offered this gift. And see, the trouble is, Christians have reduced the atonement to exchangeism.
Yes.
Tyndale coined the word, he was influenced by Wycliffe, but Tyndale coined the word, and it just means at one met.
Mm-hmm.
But Christians use it to say, oh, you have to atone for your sins, right, which is this for that. Yep. It's economy of exchange. And it's amazing how often fundamental doctrines that are essential to Christianity, that are part of the ancient creeds, get warped into exchangeism, because that's the way our brains work. And I see it happening into myself. If something horrible occurs to me one day, I go, my first thought is, oh, I didn't have devotions this morning. I wonder if that's why it happened to me. And then I want to slap myself and say, yeah, God doesn't, that's the way world religions operate. Yep. But God and Christianity is different than other religions.
That's right.
In a way, that's why we have the book of Job. It's saying you're suffering horribly, but it's not your fault. Mm-hmm. These are the cards you were dealt, or else you're an experiment of Satan. But I think it's a huge Old Testament statement that you shouldn't blame suffering on bad behavior. Mm-hmm. It's very natural to try to have this kind of mechanism in your life of a good living leads to a good life or a good afterlife. And I kind of earned it. And the doctrine of grace pretty much blows that away.
Yep.
When I was growing up in my little EV Free Church, we had a yellow vinyl record by Roy Rogers and Dale Evans. And one of the songs was, if you don't go to Sunday school, you'll grow up to be bad. So that was sort of what I was taught, but not going to Sunday school. You would grow up being a criminal or a drug salesman or something.
That's simple.
It's a very natural impulse to try to use religion as a mechanism to control your life and say, if I live good, my life will be good.
Yeah.
And, the fact that Jesus and Paul and Peter and so many were executed and martyred, it's kind of saying that's not really how it works. You can
not quite.
A really great life, and the world won't recognize what you're talking about, and you will end up suffering a lot.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah. Good point.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Here is one of the brilliant things that Sayers did in her radio plays to communicate that salvation is a gift, not because of works, lest anyone should boast.
Right.
And when she writes up the scene of the two thieves on the cross, we all know about the penitent thief and Jesus telling him, today you will be with me in paradise. And the way it's usually communicated is, oh, he believed and he got salvation. And it was exchange. Oh, good thing he got that belief in at the last moment. And Sayers was just so emphatic about this, that she actually has the penitent thief feeling sorry for Jesus and thinking he's kind of lunatic, crazy. And he tells the other thief, he says, come on, the guy's crazy. He actually thinks he's God Almighty. And so out of compassion for this kind of crazy Jesus on the center cross, the penitent thief says something about the fact, I'm sure what you're doing is really important. And then Jesus actually says to him, today you'll be with me in paradise. And Sayers actually writes into the script, into the stage directions, where the penitent thief goes, what? You're not crazy.
Wow.
And and he confesses his sin to Jesus, and the implication being Jesus offered him the gift of salvation there, and the thief accepted it. So she even goes that far to try to subvert this way we turned Christianity into just like every other religion, where you just got to do something, say something, go through a certain ritual, and you get your salvation.
That's extremely powerful. Sarah, I saw you had yourself unmuted a minute ago. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, but I lost it all. It'll come back to me.
You mean you're tired or something? Have you been preoccupied with something upstairs?
No. Oh no, what I was going to say was and Dr. Downing was talking about, we see suffering is not caused by, oh, I must have done something bad, therefore I'm suffering, but we also see the alternative of that. We see like there are bad people that are really prospering in the world, and I think that's something too we think about, but they're the ones who are doing this and that. So I mean, our thoughts about suffering is it's all turned upside down when we really think that it's not based on what people do or don't do, because we see wicked people prospering and righteous people suffering. So
Right.
It's a profound thought.
There's that question in the Old Testament, why do the wicked prosper? And it's kind of assuming if you're wicked, you're going to suffer. It doesn't work.
Sure.
But they're kind of going, why isn't the economy exchange? Crystal, isn't there a verse in the Old Testament that says, why don't they understand Derrida's paradigm of the economy of exchange? It doesn't work. Maybe that's
Exodus 20 something.
Yeah, somewhere in there.
Somewhere.
The Jews are kind of asking,
and
why
of course, a lot of the Old Testament, they are thinking into exchanges purposes.
Sure.
But I think that's why we need to read the Old Testament, because without the Old Testament, you don't recognize how incredibly radical Jesus was.
Yeah.
Jesus was doing something. No wonder he got crucified.
Yeah.
He was overturning just the smug assumptions of thousands of years of religion. But also what I love about the Old Testament is there, as you go through, you see these little moments where they're slowly recognizing the truth. And of course, Job is one of those moments. And the Psalms, David,
wisdom literature,
righteous suffer, as Sarah just said.
I'm reading a book by not by Lewis or Tolkien or Dorothy Sayers, by Fleming Rutledge, and she says fiction was. Paul starts out saying, "I'm not ashamed of the gospel," and she says, "Why does he have to say that? Because normally, if you're saintly, you go to heaven in a chariot. You're translated. Life is wonderful, death is easy." And she's saying, no, this guy was hung up on a cross and humiliated and crucified. And he was naked. And Paul has to say, no, I'm not ashamed of that. That's really the most important thing about the death of Christ, was that he did it for all of us. Nobody says, I'm not ashamed of Confucianism. I'm not ashamed of Plato. I'm not ashamed of Muhammad. So I love the fact that she says the whole gospel begins in shame and self-emptying and self-humiliation. We all have to say, wow, how do I take up my cross? How do I reenact that humiliation in order to become the person I need to be?
Yeah.
So I really would recommend this book by Fleming Rutledge. I realize that normally there's a canon at the Wade Center. We have 7 authors who've spoken to every possible issue, including all Christian dilemmas. But occasionally I do recommend somebody else besides our 7 authors.
Yeah, I know those are usually the only ones that exist in our minds, but you know, we have to sometimes remember there are other people that write books.
Right.
I know Fleming Rutledge's work. She's got a book on the crucifixion. I've downloaded a sample that caught my eye, and I've read her, of course, you know, back to Tolkien. I've read her Battle for Middle Earth book, which was published some time ago.
Right.
But she's written a lot of serious theological books as well. So what's that one called? Do you have it?
It's just called the Crucifixion.
Oh, that's
She
the one.
notes that the manner of Christ dying, it's the only famous person in history where the manner of their dying becomes the major point. Nobody says of Kennedy, oh, the assassination. That was the day that Kennedy got shot. Or Marie Antoinette, oh, that was the guillotining.
Yeah.
But the crucifixion was so horrible and so humiliating, the very manner of his death becomes the word for how he died. So she definitely invites you. In fact, she actually says what, in distinction with what Crystal was saying, she says, Christianity is the anti-religious religion where it's not about some kind of mechanism of control. Whereas if I do what God wants, then he has to treat me well.
Right.
She says, no, it totally explodes that notion that religion is a mechanism of control. In some ways, if we have penicillin, why do we need prayer? You know, in some ways, if we have some mechanism of getting rid of this illness, why do we pray about it? And I love that idea that Christianity is kind of the anti-religious religion in terms of totally turning the normal reasons people turn to religion, turns it on its head and says, hey, do you want to be a Christian? How about taking up the cross? How about suffering?
Yeah.
That's of ego.
Yeah.
It's not really that enticing of a sales pitch for Christianity.
No, I just recorded a little Easter thing the other day, actually, not quite little. I really went to town. It was, I had a lot on my mind. And this is one of the things that I said is that, you know, why would the evangelists lie about something they weren't expecting to happen, like double, but they weren't expecting the Messiah to, most were not expecting a divine Messiah. Most were not expecting, in fact, nobody was expecting, as far as I'm aware, a divine dead Messiah. One setting aside his, you know, prerogatives, and then no one was expecting anybody to rise ahead of the rest of humanity in Jewish Second Temple Jewish thought. And then they have the audacity to embarrass themselves, as you know, in a Jewish culture by including so many embarrassing features in the Gospels. And yet you think that they're lying about this, and then we could go on. It's ridiculous. And this anti-religion, you know, religion is a great idea, because my students are always saying, you know, why does it have to be Christianity? Why can't it be Buddhism or Islam that's the myth became fact? You know, and I said, well, that's a great question, but we've got to talk about, you know, a lot of things. And this is one of the key distinctions that you both have raised, that, you know, there's an economy of exchange in a lot of these other, you give something, you get something. And there's also nothing explosively controversial about Confucius, really. And people say, well, you know, well, that's a big deal. I'm like, yes, it's a big deal, but Confucius wasn't claiming to be the son of heaven. He wanted the son of heaven to come to earth, but, you know, it's interesting that, but it's a really great world religion sort of topic there that, you know.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. I can't imagine Peter saying, get in the part where I betrayed Christ 3 times. Make sure you get in all 3 times.
Underline that. Yeah. Like I was really into
you want to tell if you're trying to propagate a new religion, right?
No, not at all. Yeah, it's silly, but you know, we understand. We've all had our doubts and questions, and so I think it's to be encouraged. But it's like we're living in an age where we're claiming for evidence, and then, well, I don't want that evidence. I want the empirical evidence, and we treat some kinds of evidence as higher than others. And I think a lot of our job as Christians today is just helping people sort through how to think again, how to think critically, and to distinguish between these things, and not to replace science with faith or vice versa, but to show that these things aren't antithetical. And there's so much work to be done. And, you know, of course, Lewis and Sayers and Tolkien knew that there was a lot of undergrowth to clear out before one could really get to the gospel. So,
well, I think that I think that's why progressive Christianity is kind of thriving in our culture. Is that, you mentioned that it's not not a nice sales pitch to be like, hey, come be a Christian and you're going to suffer and you're going to be persecuted and it's not going to be easy. Take up your cross. But progressive Christianity is making it easier for people to be Christian. So you think you can have everything that you want, and it's just a nice easy religion. And I think people like that in this society, and people don't really want to think critically, and I think we're up against that difficult battle.
That's a really great point, Sarah. Yeah, it's everybody's welcome, and of course that's important, but the intellectual aspect of our faith is not demanding. Just pray about it. Everything's going to be okay. Let's have coffee. I mean, churches are becoming more like, cafes, and I'm not poo-pooing coffee at church or anything like that. I'm just saying that it's becoming more of a social club. And so I think it's well said. Some churches are, and it's easier to get in and easier to stay because nobody's challenging them, and, don't get any controversial conversations with people of other religions. And it's definitely easier to kind of, throw yourself behind that. For sure.
Yeah, I'm reading Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules of Living. This bestseller. He's not a Christian, but he says it's more important to have a life with meaning than have a life with happiness.
Yes.
He's not coming from a Christian point of view, but he's saying you need to figure out what the meaning of your life is rather than to say, how can I be happier? And in many ways, once you find meaning, you'll be happier sort of as a byproduct of feeling like your life has meaning.
First things first.
I'm thinking this dovetails beautifully with Christianity. There's no promise that you're going to be healthy, happy, not persecuted. But it's just saying, if you know the meaning of your life, if you know why you're on earth, if you know what you are trying to accomplish, which has become, more and more in the image of Christ, you may not be happy on this day or that day, but your life always has meaning. Your journey has meaning. And it's fascinating to me that even non-Christian thinkers are pretty much saying a Christian way of looking at the world is a meaningful way of looking at the world. And it's something that will last you your whole life.
That's well said.
Sayers talks about a delicate balance between the absolutizing of tradition and holding on to tradition for its own sake, kind of like the people who were outraged that she didn't use King James English.
Right.
And then the other extreme is the absolutizing of progress, to go back to what Sarah said. So how do you strike that balance between those two without falling one side or the other? Yeah. And it is staying balanced is part of the suffering, because you're going to get attacked from both sides, because people just want you to fall down, join them, just kind of join the club on one side or the other. And I argue that she recognizes this as a both and Christianity that is predicated upon a both and Savior. Yes. Jesus was fully human and fully divine.
Yeah. That's a distinction that I think a lot of people, even in the church, are having a hard time. That Christianity is a Near Eastern or an ancient Near Eastern, Middle Eastern religion, and that thinking in two hands is something that people are writing about a lot in getting into the Jewish roots of thinking, and this idea that both and is not a contradiction, and we have to try to understand Christianity as a series of paradoxes about reality, because that's how it's faithful to reality, because reality is slightly mysterious. We live in shadowlands, as Lewis said. So I think our thinking needs to reflect that. And then of course, going back to, striking a healthy balance with the progressives and the attachment to, continuing reframing of the faith, and then the tradition on the other end. It's a constant battle. And it's very well said. So I know we have a fifth guest in and out. She's busy. I don't know what she's doing. She keeps, I hear foots,
bed for later when she's on the floor.
I think people are going to love this. It's like, they're not going to be listening to us. They're going to be like, what's she doing? I said, she had my pillow. I'm like, what are you doing with my pillow?
He's
Come
around.
on, Annabelle, I love you. So I think maybe now's a time for closing remarks. I think this has been one of my favorite episodes. I'm sorry to our previous guests, but this has been great. I would love to keep on talking, but maybe we can wrap up. Is there anything you think we've left unsaid that needs to be said for this hour that we've spent? I mean, any closing remarks?
One of those things where we could probably go on for another hour. So there's just so much to talk about in terms of Sayers, Lewis, and Tolkien.
Yeah. And,
yeah, I wish we gave you more time to talk about Tolkien writing parables, because most people think parables sounds a little too much in terms of the message rather than the story.
Preaching,
but in general, I love the fact that we have these 3 different authors. They all love the Lord. They all want to use their art as a means of giving a gift to Christ. And I just love the idea that all 3 of them, Paul said, we're the aroma of Christ to those who are perishing. Yeah. And I feel like in many ways, every Christian artist is trying to create a fragrance that will make people say, what is that? That's important. I want to know more about that.
That's
so
beautiful.
I love the fact that all of our authors, despite their different methods, they were all trying to communicate the fragrance of Christ to those that are perishing.
Yes, amen.
Yeah.
Yes, quite agree. I just had a thought, but it went out the other end there. So the thing about Tolkien and parables, I had a final thought to share, but I think what I point some of our listeners to who may, because I know some people stumble onto most recent episodes that I've spoken a little bit about it in previous episodes on Mythic Mission, and of course I've written a book about it. But it's definitely more about the medium than the message, is what I would come back to saying. Is that it's very important. Jesus almost wanted to I think he did say, didn't he? He said, yeah, I speak to you in parables, and then the gospel, I think it's Mark, who, maybe it's all the synoptics, but nothing did he speak to them in parables. Everything was in parables or something to that extent. It's almost as if to say, now listen, the way it's being said is more important, if not at least as important as what's being said. So pay attention and give measure to how you hear. And of course, Jesus did say that. So I think that'd be my closing remark. The medium is an important part of the message itself.
Yeah, I would add to that. Somebody wrote to C.S. Lewis. He has this thick volume of letters. It takes 3 volumes. People wrote him spiritual questions. And one of them wrote and said, why was Jesus always talking over people's heads? And Lewis said, I don't think that's what was happening. I think he knew that if he made an intellectual proposition that would meet with intellectual resistance, and it would be this versus this. But if he planted a thought in their minds through a story or an image or a metaphor, that might stay in their minds longer in their imaginations, and it might bear fruit later on. So I love the idea that Jesus didn't necessarily talk over people's heads. He said things that made them think a lot longer than they would have thought if he just stated a proposition. I think I'm restating what you just said a second ago.
No, it's again just kind of proving a point, is that we have different ways of narrating truth, and it's the same truth, but it comes to people different ways.
Right.
And it's very profound. Yeah, we get to experience and kind of taste reality when we engage in a story, rather than just to digest a proposition. It's like, it's like a math equation. It's this equals that. It's very simple.
Right.
So I think it's well said.
Well, and the more you read something, now she presses the card with the princess music right when I end here.
It's perfect. It's perfect.
A little closing music for you all.
Yes.
The more that you read a story, the more you get out of it, and stories are so powerful. And I just think that, for people who aren't Christian, but so many people love reading, that to find Christ, to not even know you're finding him yet, but the more you come back to him, the more you realize, there's something about that I can't quite put my finger on.
Yep.
I just think it's so great that there's so many authors out there doing, like you were saying, different methods of kind of presenting Christ to people, just to leave it with them thinking about it and coming back to it and wanting more.
Right.
Yes. And I think the next episode will be how to be an apologist mom, and how to manage your time when 4-year-olds won't sleep. Super Sarah episode, special edition. It's going to be the next one. So we're going to interview you about how are you sleeping these days?
It's just like the one night. I'm like, the one night, Annabelle, I really need you to go to bed, is the one night you're up.
Oh, it's going to be the greatest episode yet, though. I'm guaranteeing you. Like, the Downings, Chahosky, who cares? You know, what's that little girl doing? Yeah. So funny. Well, this has been great. Crystal, did you have something you wanted to say? I'm sorry.
No, just
Okay.
thank you.
Very good.
Thank you. This has been great, guys. Thank you for sharing your time. I know basketball's on, and enjoy the rest of your evenings. And everybody, thank you so much for joining all five
Great.
of us.
Really enjoyed this conversation.
Yes,
Thanks,
us too.
Michael. Thanks,
Thank you.
Sarah.
Thank you. Nice to meet you. Say thanks for listening.
Bye-bye.
Bye.